There is a stainless steel chamber. It is shaped like an inverted pyramid, narrow at the bottom, wider at the top, with sides too smooth to climb and a depth too great to see over. It is approximately the size of a large bucket, and at the bottom of it, in total darkness, sits a baby monkey. Not for an hour, not for a day, for up to 1 year. No mother, no warmth, no touch, no play, no face looking back. Nothing but the cold geometry of the chamber and the absolute, unbroken silence of complete isolation. The monkey that comes out of that chamber after a year is not the monkey that went in. It rocks. It mutilates itself. It cannot form a relationship, cannot engage in play, cannot function in the company of other monkeys. It sits in the corner and stares at nothing. And when researchers attempt to reintroduce it to social life, to give it back what was taken, it cannot receive it. The window apparently has closed. Harry Harlow called this device the pit of despair. He named it himself. He knew what it was. He built it anyway, and what he found at the bottom of it became the most complete model of severe depression that psychology had ever produced. Unlike every other experiment in this series, the subjects here were not human. They were rhesus monkeys. But the damage Harlow documented and the understanding of depression it produced belongs in this series precisely because it speaks more directly to the human condition than almost anything else we have covered. Welcome back to The Darkest Experiments. We have arrived at the final chapter, Chapter 8, The Darkest Depths. The experiments gathered here occupy a different moral category from everything that has come before. Not because the previous chapters were light, they were not, but because what you are about to hear crosses a threshold that the other studies, for all their violations, did not reach. These are the studies where the boundary between science and cruelty did not blur. It collapsed entirely. We begin with Harry Harlow, a man who, in the first half of his career, gave psychology one of its most important and most humane discoveries, and who in the second half descended into a darkness that his own findings should have prevented him from entering. Harry Harlow was a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin, whose work in the 1950s and early 1960s fundamentally changed the way science understood infant attachment and emotional development. His famous studies with rhesus monkeys demonstrated something that behaviorism, the dominant school of psychology at the time, had flatly denied: that infants need love. Specifically, Harlow showed that infant monkeys separated from their mothers would consistently choose a soft cloth surrogate mother over a wire surrogate mother that provided food. Comfort, warmth, and the sensation of being held mattered more to the developing infant than physical sustenance. It was a finding that overturned decades of parenting advice, the cold behaviorist counsel that holding and comforting infants would spoil them, and replaced it with something closer to the truth: that emotional connection is not a luxury, it is a biological necessity. That discovery was genuinely important. It was humane. It had direct and lasting positive effects on the understanding of child development, on the care of institutionalized children, and on the psychology of attachment that underpins modern therapy. And then Harlow kept going. By the late 1960s, Harlow was in the grip of severe depression himself, a condition that his biographers suggest was closely connected to the direction his research was taking, in a way that is difficult to untangle. He began designing experiments intended not to understand attachment, but to understand its destruction, to map, with scientific precision, what happened to a living creature when everything necessary for psychological survival was systematically removed. He created a series of isolation chambers of varying severity. Some monkeys were isolated for 3 months, some for 6, some for a full year. Some had partial contact. They could see and hear other monkeys but could not touch them. Others were placed in the pit of despair itself, the stainless steel inverted pyramid, in conditions of near total sensory and social deprivation. The results were not surprising to anyone who had read Harlow's earlier work. They were, in fact, the logical extension of it. If love and connection are necessary for healthy psychological development, then the removal of love and connection produces psychological devastation, which is precisely what Harlow documented. Monkeys isolated for 3 months showed significant disturbance, but some capacity for recovery when reintroduced to social contact. Monkeys isolated for 6 months showed more severe damage. Monkeys isolated for a full year, the ones who spent 12 months at the bottom of the pit of despair, emerged in a state of psychological ruin that appeared, by every measure Harlow could apply, to be permanent. They rocked compulsively, back and forth, in the stereotyped movement associated with severe institutionalized trauma in both monkeys and humans. They mutilated themselves, biting their own limbs, tearing at their own skin. When placed with other monkeys, they did not engage. They sat apart, stared blankly, made no attempt at social interaction. When female monkeys from the isolation studies were artificially impregnated and gave birth, they were unable to care for their infants. They pushed them away, ignored them, and in some cases, attacked them. The deprivation they had experienced had left them unable to give what they had never received. Harlow described the behavior of his most severely isolated subjects as resembling human psychosis. He was not wrong. And that resemblance was ultimately the scientific justification he offered for the work, that by producing and studying an animal model of depression and psychosis, he was generating insights that could one day benefit human patients. The scientific community's response to Harlow's isolation work was divided from the beginning and has moved steadily toward condemnation in the decades since. The core ethical objection is not difficult to state. Harlow was deliberately producing severe, permanent psychological suffering in sentient creatures who had done nothing to deserve it and had no ability to understand or consent to what was happening to them. The justification that animal suffering can be ethically imposed when the knowledge gained benefits humans is one that has a long history in scientific research and one that carries genuine weight in many contexts. The use of animals in medical research has produced treatments that have saved millions of lives. That is real and it matters. But the question that Harlow's isolation studies force is a more specific one. Was the knowledge produced by the pit of despair worth the suffering it required? Was there no other way to study depression? Was total isolation for a year the minimum necessary intervention, or did the experimental design reflect something other than scientific necessity? Critics then and since have argued that Harlow already knew, from his own earlier work, that monkeys required emotional connection for healthy development. The isolation experiments did not discover something unknown. They confirmed, in increasingly extreme fashion, something already established. The marginal scientific gain from each escalation in severity and duration was not proportional to the escalation in suffering it produced. Harlow himself, in some of his later writing, expressed a complicated relationship with the work. He was not a man without conscience, but he was a man who had built a career around a research program, who was suffering from his own severe depression, and who had surrounded himself with an institutional structure that continued to fund and publish what he was doing. The pit of despair kept operating, because nobody stopped it. Harlow's isolation research did contribute to the scientific understanding of depression in ways that have had genuine clinical value. The animal model he developed informed research into antidepressant medications and into the neurobiological mechanisms of attachment and loss. The understanding that early social deprivation produces lasting neurological change, that the damage is not merely psychological but physical, written into the developing brain, has influenced everything from adoption policy to the design of neonatal intensive care units. That legacy is real, but it sits, permanently and uncomfortably, alongside the image of a small monkey at the bottom of a stainless steel chamber, rocking in the dark. Both things are true, and the inability to resolve that tension cleanly is not a failure of moral reasoning. It is an accurate reflection of what the pit of despair actually was. Harlow's work tells us something about depression that clinical language sometimes obscures. Depression is not primarily a chemical imbalance in the brain, or at least it is not only that. It is, at its root, a response to the experience of being without the things that living creatures require to survive and flourish. Connection, safety, the reliable presence of something warm that holds you. The monkey in the pit of despair was not malfunctioning. It was responding with perfect biological logic to an environment that had given it nothing to live for. And when it was removed from that environment, the damage did not reverse, because the developing brain had been shaped by what it experienced in those critical early months, and the shaping was permanent. That understanding has profound implications for how we think about human depression, human trauma, and the environments we build for children, for elderly people, for prisoners, for anyone in the care of an institution that controls their access to connection and warmth. The pit of despair was a chamber in a Wisconsin laboratory. But its logic, isolation, deprivation, the removal of everything that makes life bearable, operates in the world in subtler forms every day. Recognizing it, naming it, and refusing to accept it as the inevitable condition of vulnerable people, that is the most direct response Harlow's work makes possible. Connection is not a comfort, it is a necessity. And denying it to any creature capable of feeling its absence is not a neutral act. Harry Harlow began his career proving that love is real and necessary. He ended it proving what the absence of love produces. Both halves of that work are part of his legacy, the warmth and the darkness, inseparable, impossible to fully reconcile. The monkeys who emerged from the pit of despair could not be fixed. The damage was done. What remained was the knowledge, hard-won, ethically indefensible, and genuinely important, that no living creature should be placed in a pit of despair in the first place. Next time, we leave the laboratory and travel to Guatemala. The year is 1946. A team of American researchers, funded by the United States government, has arrived with a supply of penicillin, a research protocol, and a plan that will not be revealed to the world for over 60 years. They are going to deliberately infect over 1,000 people with sexually transmitted diseases. And the people they have chosen cannot say no. That is the Guatemala syphilis experiment. And it is one of the most significant government crimes in the history of medical research. Subscribe so you're here for it. Leave a comment. Harlow's story raises the hardest questions in this series about the relationship between knowledge and suffering. What do you think? I'll see you in the next one.